It was a typical Thursday morning in Dallas, Texas. The streets buzzed with the usual chaos of early commuters. The honking horns, the rush of cars speeding through red lights, the hurried footsteps of people trying to catch the bus, and the soft chatter of kids on their way to school created the symphony of a city alive and thriving. But something about the day felt different, as if a heavy weight was pressing down on the air. The sun was hidden behind a thick, unnatural fog that rolled in from the east, seeping across the pavement like a slow-moving tide. The usual blue sky was replaced by a dull ashen gray that seemed to cast a strange shadow over the city. The fog itself wasn't so unusual. Dallas had its fair share of morning mist. But this one was different. It hung in the air far longer than it should have, refusing to dissipate, even as the clock ticked past noon. People noticed it, certainly, but they shrugged it off. It was just another weather oddity. Just another strange day in the unpredictable life of a major American city. They had other things to worry about. Meetings, school projects, lunches to pack. It was business as usual, even if the fog seemed to make everything feel just a little bit more wrong. The morning went on with its normal pace, though there was an unease that settled like a weight on everyone's shoulders. A few more people glanced over their shoulders as they walked down the street, frowning at the unsettling fog. A few pedestrians coughed in the damp air, but no one thought to question why the city felt so thick and oppressive. People continued with their lives, but beneath the surface, something was stirring, something that no one could see, but everyone could feel. It wasn't until 11:42 a.m. that the first sign of something truly out of place occurred. The scream was high-pitched, frantic, and it sliced through the air like a knife, shattering the murmur of the city. It came from Main Street, just a block away from the central intersection. People froze for a second, unsure whether it was a prank or an accident. But then another scream followed, then another, each one louder and more desperate than the last. A man, running at full speed, emerged from the fog, a disheveled figure, his clothes torn and stained with something dark and sticky. His face was pale, his eyes wild, filled with an uncontrollable fury. People who were closest to him stopped in their tracks, not understanding what was happening, their hearts skipping a beat as they watched him stagger forward. His hands, slick with blood, reached out to the nearest pedestrian, a woman, walking her dog, screamed in horror as the man lunged at her. Before anyone could react, the man sank his teeth into the woman's neck. She fell to the ground in shock, her dog yelping in terror as the attacker held on to her, biting and gnawing with an unnatural frenzy. The sound of tearing flesh echoed in the otherwise quiet street, but it was drowned out by the woman's screams of pain. She kicked and struggled, but the man's grip was too strong. His jaws locked onto her like a predator in the wild. By now, the fog had thickened, and the scene was shrouded in a cold, eerie mist. People stood frozen for a moment, their minds struggling to process what they were seeing. This wasn't a random act of violence. This wasn't some mugger or gang fight. It was something far darker. There was something deeply wrong about the way the man moved, how his hands and body twitched as though they weren't fully in control, as if something else was driving him. The woman, lying on the pavement, managed to push herself up with what little strength she had left. But before she could escape, the man's hands shot out again, grabbing her and pulling her back down with horrifying strength. Another scream erupted, but it wasn't the woman's. It came from someone else in the crowd, someone who had just witnessed the brutal attack. "Call 911! Someone! Call 911!" a voice shouted from the crowd. But by the time anyone could react, the man had already moved on. His eyes were wild, unblinking, as if he had no care for who or what he attacked. His hands were covered in blood, and his mouth, smeared with it, had a feral, animalistic grin that sent a chill down everyone's spine. Within seconds, chaos erupted on Main Street. The man, having finished with the woman, was already running toward another group of pedestrians, his arms flailing as he reached out for the nearest person. They backed away, but it was too late. His mouth found its target, sinking deep into the neck of a man who had been too slow to react. The man screamed, clutching at his attacker's arms. But there was no escaping the onslaught. His body went limp within moments, lifeless as the attacker began to move on to the next person. At that point, the reality set in. People scattered in all directions, running, screaming, and trying to escape the madness unfolding in front of them. But no matter where they went, it was as though the fog had swallowed them whole. It was impossible to escape it. The attackers, there were more now, coming from all sides, each of them moving in a terrifying, relentless fashion, continued their assault, each one worse than the last. They didn't speak. They didn't reason. They didn't feel fear or mercy. They were driven by an insatiable hunger, one that could only be satisfied by the blood of the living. The people who tried to help were now running for their lives. Those who had once been standing in shock now pushed past each other in panic, looking for any safe place to hide. But the city had turned into a death trap. The fog blocked their vision. The streets were unfamiliar and labyrinthine, and everywhere they turned, they encountered more of them. More of those pale, blood-covered figures, stumbling forward, their faces twisted into grotesque expressions. The police arrived within minutes, but by then it was too late. Officers, armed with nothing but their handguns, found themselves hopelessly outmatched. The attackers, if they could even be called that, were relentless, each one seemingly impervious to the bullets that were fired at them. Those that were shot didn't fall. They simply kept coming, eyes burning with a singular rage. Reports flooded in as more of the city's residents realized what was happening. Phones rang off the hook. Social media exploded with messages, and the news stations began broadcasting live footage of the horrors unfolding in the streets. But no one knew what was causing this madness. No one could explain it. The authorities, overwhelmed and in shock themselves, had no answers. And that was just the beginning. As the hours passed, it became clear that this wasn't an isolated incident. It was something far worse, something that Dallas hadn't seen in its worst nightmares. People died, but something else happened. They didn't stay dead. They came back. The fog, which had seemed like an oddity in the morning, now felt like an omen, a harbinger of the nightmare that was about to sweep across the city. Dallas had just become ground zero for something far more terrifying than anyone had imagined. And as the sun began to set, it became clear that what had started on this normal Thursday morning was only the beginning of the end. The city was falling, and there was no one left to save it. The chaos unfolded quicker than anyone could process. By mid-afternoon, the news stations were flooded with reports of more attacks, each one worse than the last. The events on Main Street were just the beginning. At first, it seemed like an isolated incident, an attack by a man gone mad. But soon, it became clear that this was something much worse, something that could not be contained. The reports didn't stop. They only got louder and more terrifying. Footage from phone cameras, shaky and distorted, began circulating the internet. People watched in horror as clips of the infected, those who had been turned, tore through crowds with terrifying speed. Their eyes were wide and unblinking, filled with an unnatural gleam, while their mouths hung open, dripping with saliva and blood. They moved like animals, faster than anyone had ever seen, attacking anyone they could reach. Some tore at the flesh of their victims with their bare hands, while others sank their teeth into the soft parts of their bodies, ripping and tearing with a ferocity that seemed impossible. It was like something out of a horror movie, but it was real, and it was happening right in the heart of Dallas. By 2:00 p.m., the situation had escalated far beyond anyone's control. The attacks were no longer confined to isolated areas. They were happening on every street, in every neighborhood. Panic spread like wildfire. People fled from their homes, not knowing where to go or who to trust. They ran through the streets, desperate to escape the monsters that were now chasing them. There was no safe place anymore. The city was unraveling piece by piece. In just a few hours, Dallas had gone from being a bustling metropolis to a war zone. The once vibrant streets were now empty, save for the twisted figures stumbling through the fog, their eyes wide and hungry. The hospitals were quickly overwhelmed with the injured, their emergency rooms flooded with patients who had been bitten or attacked. But there was nothing the doctors could do. The infection spread faster than they could comprehend. Those who had been bitten or scratched didn't show signs of recovery. They only got worse. Within minutes, their skin turned pale, their veins darkened, and their bodies trembled as though something inside them was trying to break free. A few of the more fortunate survivors who had made it to the hospital weren't so lucky. Some of the doctors and nurses who initially tried to help found themselves turning just as quickly as the patients. Those who didn't succumb to the infection in the hospital were faced with the sight of their coworkers attacking others, ripping through the hospital corridors with a hunger they couldn't explain. They had no choice but to lock themselves in rooms, barricading themselves from the chaos outside. By the time the authorities realized that they couldn't contain the outbreak, it was already too late. The police and fire departments tried their best to control the situation, but the wave of infected was simply too large. Officers, armed with handguns, tried to stop the attackers, but bullets didn't seem to have any effect. The infected didn't drop when they were shot. They didn't even flinch. They simply kept coming, dragging themselves across the pavement with an unholy determination. Reports continued to flood in, many of them from terrified survivors who had managed to get to safety. But even that was becoming less and less reliable. The phone lines were overloaded, and social media was being flooded with frantic pleas for help, though most of the posts were short-lived, as more and more people went silent. By late afternoon, entire neighborhoods were barricading themselves in their homes. People who had once been strangers were now banding together, creating makeshift fortresses out of whatever they could find. Apartments, homes, stores. Nothing was safe. People in the city took refuge in buildings with thick walls and strong doors, hoping that the undead wouldn't be able to get in. But the infected were relentless. No matter how strong the barricades, no matter how much noise people made to distract them, the undead found a way through. Some tried to flee by car, but the streets were jammed with panicked drivers, all trying to escape the nightmare, all heading in different directions, colliding into one another. It was pure chaos. The emergency sirens blared in the distance, but there was no help coming. The city's emergency services were overwhelmed, and the police were no longer able to restore any sense of order. The National Guard was called in, but their response was slow. By the time they arrived, Dallas was already consumed by the infection, and the military's presence only added to the panic. Helicopters hovered above, but even they couldn't do much against the ever-growing horde. At first, there was an attempt to quarantine the area. Exclusion zones were set up, and military checkpoints were established around the outskirts of the city. But the infected didn't stay in one place. They were everywhere, and the barriers that were supposed to contain them only slowed their advance. The virus was spreading far faster than anyone had predicted. The infected didn't need to be bitten to pass the infection on. All they had to do was touch someone, scrape their skin, or even breathe on them. And soon, that person would be one of them. Within hours, hospitals that had once been the cornerstone of care and recovery became breeding grounds for the undead. Those who had been rushed in with minor wounds were now turning into savages, ripping through the staff, consuming anyone they could catch. Panic-stricken doctors and nurses tried to escape, but many of them were too late. The dead walked the halls, their eyes blank, their mouths dripping with blood. The medical staff, helpless against the onslaught, could only watch as the world they knew turned to madness. Soon, the scope of the infection began to take shape. It wasn't confined to just Dallas anymore. Reports from neighboring cities came flooding in. Fort Worth, Arlington, Plano. The infection was spreading outward, infecting anyone in its path. The airports were closed, but it didn't matter. People were already fleeing the city by any means they could find. Some tried to escape by walking or driving, but as the night wore on, they realized the entire state of Texas was slowly becoming consumed. The infection didn't care for borders or barriers. It was spreading faster than anyone could imagine. With every passing hour, the situation grew bleaker. The fear that gripped the city wasn't just because of the zombies. It was because no one knew how to stop it. No one knew what the infection was, where it came from, or how to stop it. People could only hide and hope that they wouldn't be the next ones, turned into mindless creatures, driven by an insatiable hunger. The people of Dallas weren't just facing an apocalypse. They were facing a nightmare that seemed to have no end. The undead were everywhere now, and the city, once a symbol of life and energy, had become a shell of its former self, consumed by death, despair, and the bloodthirsty hunger of the infected. It was the beginning of a horror that no one could escape. By the time night fell, the situation in Dallas had deteriorated beyond anything anyone could have imagined. The streets, once teeming with life and noise, were now silent, save for the distant growls and moans that echoed from the shadows. The city was officially in lockdown. The government had declared martial law, but it was clear that no amount of authority could stop the nightmare that was unfolding. Dallas had become a war zone, a place where survival depended on one thing: staying alive. A group of survivors had found refuge in an old, run-down grocery store near the city center. It wasn't much, but it was the best they could do under the circumstances. The building was small, with only one exit, which they had barricaded with whatever they could find: empty shelves, cans of food, boxes, and crates. It was enough to slow down the undead, but no one was foolish enough to believe it would hold them off for long. They could hear the scratching and pounding at the door every few minutes as the infected clawed and scraped at the barricade. The sound was constant, like a drumbeat of death that never stopped. Mark, the former police officer, sat in the corner, staring at the floor. His mind was racing, trying to come up with a plan. But with every passing minute, the odds of escaping alive seemed slimmer. He had been through tough situations before. High-speed chases, gunfights, and even hostage situations. But none of that had prepared him for what was happening now. There were no suspects to arrest, no criminals to catch. This was something far more terrifying. And there was no law or order left to restore. It was just chaos, and they were trapped in the middle of it. Beside him, Sarah, the nurse, was tending to the wounds of a couple of teenagers who had been caught in the chaos earlier that day. One of them, a young girl named Emily, had a deep gash on her leg from when she had tripped while running from an infected. The bleeding had slowed, but the wound was still raw and angry, and Sarah had to be careful not to infect the area. There were no antibiotics, no sterile supplies, just the basics, bandages, gauze, and antiseptic, all of which were running low. The other teenager, a boy named Jake, was sitting next to Emily. "We don't know, kid," Mark said, his voice gruff and tired. "We don't know where this started or how it spread, but what we do know is that it's not going to stop. The world we knew is gone, and now it's just about surviving." Sarah looked up from her work, glancing at the others. "We need to focus on keeping quiet and staying safe for now. We can't keep the barricades up forever, and I don't know how much longer we'll be able to hold out here." They all knew the truth of it. It wasn't just the infected that posed a threat anymore. There were no longer any guarantees in the world outside. The infected were relentless, but so were the other survivors. There had already been reports of people turning on each other. Gangs, desperate individuals, and even whole families who had turned savage in their fight for survival. It was every man for himself now. Trust was a luxury they couldn't afford. The store, which had once been a bustling hub of commerce, now felt like a tomb. The shelves were mostly empty, picked clean by people desperate to stockpile food and supplies. The small refrigerator in the back was barely working, but they had found a few cans of food and some bottled water. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep them going for a little while longer. Mark stood up and walked over to the window, peering out through the dirty glass. The street outside was a mess of abandoned cars and broken windows. The faintest glow of streetlights flickered in the distance, casting long, eerie shadows across the street. In the darkness, he could just make out the shapes of the infected, stumbling through the streets. Some were moving aimlessly, while others were dragging themselves along the ground, drawn by some unseen force. It was like watching a plague spread across the land. And the worst part was that it was impossible to escape. There are more of them out there than I thought, Mark muttered, his voice low. They're everywhere. Sarah joined him at the window, her eyes scanning the streets. She could see them too, the infected, their bodies swaying in the shadows, their eyes empty, lost. They weren't just out for blood. They were hunting. And they were getting closer. The realization hit them both at the same time. The barricades wouldn't hold forever. The undead were relentless. And soon, they would find a way in. We need a plan, Sarah said, her voice steady but tense. If we're going to survive this, we need to figure out how to move. How to get out of this store before we're overrun. Mark nodded grimly. We can't stay here much longer. We need to make it to the outskirts of the city. Find a safe place. Maybe even try to get out of Dallas altogether. But we can't just run blindly. We need a way to get through the streets without drawing attention. If we go out there, we'll be sitting ducks. The sound of the undead outside grew louder, their growls rising in volume. They were getting closer. The tension inside the store was unbearable. Mark felt the weight of the decision pressing down on him. They couldn't stay in this store forever. Eventually, the infected would break through the barricades, and when that happened, there would be no escape. Jake, the younger of the two teens, stood up and paced nervously. What about the cars outside? We could grab one and drive out of here. Mark shook his head. It's too risky. The streets are a mess, and there are too many infected out there. We won't get far before we're swarmed. Sarah looked at the barricades. We can't stay here, but we can't just walk out the front door either. Maybe we can use the back entrance, sneak through the alleys. It's our best shot, Mark said, his eyes narrowing. We'll need to move fast and stay quiet. No unnecessary risks. If we make it out, we can head for the edge of the city and find shelter. But we'll have to keep our wits about us. One wrong move and it's over. As the night dragged on, the group fell into a tense silence, each of them lost in their own thoughts. Outside, the growls of the infected became more pronounced, echoing in the empty streets. They were getting closer. The time to act was approaching, and none of them were sure whether they would make it through the night. But one thing was certain. If they wanted to survive, they had no choice but to move. The nightmare was only beginning, and there was no turning back now. The night had fallen cold and heavy over the abandoned grocery store. The dim glow of flashlights and the faint hum of a battery-powered radio filled the space where the group huddled together, trying to make sense of the chaos that had consumed Dallas. The air inside the store was thick with the smell of sweat, fear, and the lingering scent of something rotten. They had settled in, making the best of their limited resources. But there was an undeniable tension in the air. It had been days since they had last seen any sign of other survivors. And though they tried to keep the hope alive, they couldn't ignore the growing sense of dread that had settled over them all. Mark, the former police officer who had been their anchor in the beginning, had become increasingly distant. At first, it was small things. How he would stare out the window for hours, his eyes vacant, as if he were searching for something beyond the fog. Then, his movements started to slow down, like the weight of the world had settled on his shoulders. His once steady, confident demeanor had begun to crack, revealing a fragility that no one could ignore. But it wasn't just his behavior that had become concerning. It was his appearance. His skin, once tanned and healthy, had turned a sickly pale, and there were dark, almost black veins creeping up his neck and arms. Sarah, ever the observant one, was the first to notice the changes. She was busy bandaging up Emily's leg, checking the wound for infection, when she glanced up and saw Mark sitting in the corner, his hands trembling slightly as he clutched a can of beans, not even noticing that he was crushing it. His eyes were unfocused, and his mouth moved in whispers that were barely audible, his lips curling in strange patterns. At first, she thought he was muttering to himself, a side effect of the stress they were all under. But as she listened more closely, she realized the words didn't make sense. He was saying things like, "They're here, and the fog won't stop, and it's happening again." The unease that had been building in Sarah's chest finally bubbled to the surface. She got up and approached him, kneeling down next to him. "Mark, are you okay?" she asked, her voice soft but tinged with concern. Mark's head snapped to the side, his eyes locking with hers for a brief moment before they glazed over again. His pupils were dilated, and there was no recognition in his gaze. "I'm fine," he muttered, but his voice was strained, as if the words were forced out of him. "It's just, I'm tired, Sarah. I'm tired of fighting." Sarah felt a shiver run down her spine. Tired of fighting? They were all tired, but they couldn't stop. Not now. Not when they were so close to finding a way out. She placed a hand on his shoulder, trying to offer comfort, but Mark recoiled slightly, his body jerking as if something inside him had snapped. He quickly stood up, his movements jerky and unnatural. He stumbled, his hand gripping the shelf to steady himself, his breathing shallow and rapid. "Mark?" Sarah asked. "Mark, listen to me," Sarah pleaded, her voice more urgent now. "You have to fight it. You have to hold on." But Mark didn't respond. Instead, he let out a low growl, a sound that wasn't human at all. His body jerked violently, his hands shaking as he reached for her. "Sarah," he whispered, but his voice was a guttural rasp, like it was coming from somewhere far away. "I can't." Before anyone could react, his body lunged forward, his hands gripping Sarah's throat with terrifying strength. Her breath was cut off as Mark's fingers squeezed around her neck. She gasped for air, trying to break free, but his grip was unyielding, his strength unnatural. She could feel his nails digging into her skin, the panic rising in her chest as she struggled against him. The others, Jake and Emily, hadn't been able to react fast enough. They were frozen, staring in shock, as the former police officer they had come to trust had turned into something unrecognizable. Emily screamed, but her voice was lost in the chaos. Jake rushed forward, but he hesitated, unsure what to do. The once brave and reliable Mark was now a monster, consumed by the very infection they had been running from. Sarah's vision started to blur as she fought for breath, her hands desperately clawing at Mark's arms, trying to pry them off her neck. The desperation in her movements only made him tighten his grip. "Please, Mark," she choked out, her voice barely a whisper. Then, with a sudden surge of adrenaline, she did the only thing she could think to do. She grabbed the nearest object, an empty bottle of bleach, and smashed it against Mark's head. The glass shattered, the sharp edges cutting through his skin, but it didn't stop him. His eyes widened, and his mouth twisted into an animalistic snarl. He didn't even flinch. Jake, now fully panicked, grabbed a metal pipe from the floor and swung it at Mark's head. The blow landed hard, knocking Mark back slightly, but still he didn't stop. Instead, he staggered forward, his eyes wild and unfocused, his mouth dripping with saliva. He lunged at Jake this time, his hands outstretched like claws. Jake screamed and swung the pipe again, this time hitting Mark's chest. But it was no use. The infection had taken hold. The man they had relied on for guidance was now just another mindless predator. With a final scream, Mark fell onto Jake, knocking him to the ground. Sarah scrambled back, her heart pounding in her chest as she reached for something, anything, to defend herself. Emily, too, had found a broken piece of wood and was swinging it at Mark's back. But it wasn't enough. Mark was already too far gone. In the end, it was Sarah who had to do it. With a deep breath, she reached into her bag and pulled out the last of their weapons. A handgun. Small, but effective. She didn't hesitate. She couldn't afford to. With trembling hands, she aimed and fired. The shot rang out, echoing in the small store, and Mark's body went limp in an instant. The once strong and dependable officer was no more. His body collapsed in front of them, lifeless. The silence that followed was suffocating. Sarah stood there, the gun still in her hand, staring at what had once been their friend. Her heart ached with the weight of the decision she had just made. She had known, deep down, that this was coming. But that didn't make it any easier. Mark was gone, and in his place was something monstrous, something they could never have prepared for. The group stood motionless for a long time, none of them sure of what to say. Mark had been their rock, their protector. Now he was just another casualty in a world that no longer made sense. This moment made it clear to them all. Survival wasn't just about fighting zombies. It was about surviving each other. The fear, the doubt, the decisions, they were all part of the nightmare now. And the worst part was, it wasn't over. They had survived Mark's attack, but how much longer could they last in this hellish world? In the end, survival wasn't just about fighting the undead. It was about confronting the horrors within themselves. As the days stretched on, the survivors found themselves growing increasingly weary. They had grown accustomed to the unrelenting pressure of survival, the constant threat of the undead lurking just beyond the walls of their refuge. But something was different now. It wasn't just the eerie quiet of the abandoned city, or the unshakable sense of dread that had settled over them. No, it was the moon. Every night, it seemed to hang just a little lower in the sky, casting an unsettling crimson glow over Dallas. It was as if the city itself had been cursed, bathed in the light of a blood-red omen. The blood moon, as they called it, had become a nightly fixture in the sky, casting an unnatural hue over the darkened streets, making the world look like something out of a nightmare. At first, they tried to ignore it. The moon was just another strange occurrence in a world gone mad. But as the nights wore on, it became impossible to ignore. The moon wasn't just some celestial phenomenon. It was changing everything. With each night, the undead seemed to grow more restless, more aggressive, as though the blood moon was calling to them, beckoning them to hunt, to kill, and to feed. The streets that had once been eerily silent now pulsed with the distant growls and shrieks of the infected. It was like the moon was controlling them, urging them forward with a terrifying force that no one could explain. The survivors could feel the shift. They could see it in the way the undead moved. Faster, more determined, and more savage than they had been before. Where once the creatures had shuffled aimlessly through the streets, now they sprinted, eyes wide, with an insatiable hunger. The air itself seemed to change under the blood moon's influence, thick with the smell of decay and death, and every shadow seemed to pulse with a malevolent life of its own. The survivors had learned to be quiet, to stay hidden, but under the blood moon, hiding seemed futile. It was as if the infected knew where they were, always just a step behind, driven by some primal force they could not escape. The first night, Sarah noticed the change. She was awake, restless as usual, lying on a makeshift cot in the back of their hideout, listening to the sounds of the city outside. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something worse than anything they had encountered before. The air felt heavy, thick, with an almost palpable sense of dread. It was in the way the wind howled against the broken windows, the way the shadows seemed to stretch farther into the corners of the room, like they were waiting for something to happen. Sarah glanced out the small crack in the curtain and saw the blood moon hanging low in the sky, its red glow casting an unnatural light over the streets. For a moment, she just stared at it, mesmerized by its eerie beauty. But then, a shiver ran down her spine. She couldn't explain it, but something about that moon filled her with a sense of unease, as if it was watching her, waiting for something. Suddenly, she felt a cold breath on the back of her neck. She whipped around, heart racing, but the room was empty. Her breath hitched as she looked back at the moon, a feeling of dread creeping over her like a thick fog. And then it happened. Her vision blurred, and for a split second, she felt as if she was being pulled into the sky, into that blood-red moon. Her surroundings disappeared, and all she could see was darkness, deep, oppressive, suffocating. And in that darkness, she saw a figure, an old man, standing just outside the circle of her vision. He was hunched over, his face pale and drawn with deep lines that spoke of age and sorrow. His eyes, however, were wide, almost manic, as though he had seen something that had broken his mind. He opened his mouth, and Sarah felt his words inside her head, whispering directly into her thoughts. "They're coming for you all," he said, his voice crackling like dry leaves, "and there's no escape." The words were chilling, their meaning sinking into Sarah's bones. Before she could respond, the vision snapped away, and she was back in the room, her heart pounding in her chest. She gasped for air, her body trembling, as she tried to make sense of what had just happened. The man's words echoed in her mind, repeating over and over, "They're coming, and there's no escape." The rest of the night passed in a blur, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The unease in her gut only grew stronger as the moon hung in the sky, casting its bloody light over the world below. The sounds of the undead grew louder, their growls and The next morning, the group gathered in their usual spot in the corner of the store, trying to make a plan for the day. Mark, Jake, and Emily were all present, but Sarah could see the exhaustion in their faces, the weight of fear pressing down on their shoulders. They hadn't spoken much since the previous night, but it was clear that something had shifted. The air felt different, heavier, and the moon, that damn moon, still hung there, casting its sinister light over the world. As Sarah recounted the vision to the others, she could see the doubt in their eyes. They had all seen things, strange, terrifying things, but the idea of the blood moon having any influence over the undead seemed too fantastical, even for them. But as Sarah spoke, she could see the unease growing in their expressions. They knew something had changed. They could feel it too. When they ventured outside to scavenge for food later that day, they were met with a scene unlike anything they had ever seen before. The streets, once filled with the slow, shuffling forms of the undead, were now teeming with new creatures. Faster, stronger, more vicious. They ran through the streets in packs, hunting, moving with a terrifying precision. Their movements were coordinated, their eyes filled with an unholy hunger. The once slow zombies were now terrifying predators, tearing through the city with an almost military efficiency. It was as though the blood moon had transformed them, somehow enhancing their strength and speed, pushing them to a new level of terror. No longer were they the stumbling, mindless creatures they had once been. They were predators now, and the city was their hunting ground. The survivors knew they couldn't stay in Dallas much longer. They had to leave. They had to escape before the Blood Moon's influence spread even further, before they, too, became part of the nightmare. But as Sarah looked out at the chaos unfolding around her, the words of the old man echoed in her mind. They're coming for you all, and there's no escape. The horror of what lay ahead weighed on her, but she had no choice but to move forward. The Blood Moon had awakened something inside the undead, and the survivors were no longer fighting just for their lives. They were fighting for their very souls. With the streets overrun by these faster, stronger creatures, the survivors' chances of making it out of the city, a grocery store, had long since ceased to feel like a safe haven. The survivors, once grateful for its shelter, now saw it as a ticking time bomb, a fragile barrier between them and the chaos that lurked just beyond the walls. It had been their home for days, weeks maybe, but the world outside had grown more dangerous by the hour. The undead were not only growing in numbers, but their relentless pursuit seemed to become more focused with each passing day. They had learned the hard way that no barricade, no matter how sturdy, could hold back the tide of the dead forever. Every morning, the survivors woke to the sickening sound of groaning and scratching at the doors, the undead waiting for them. Each night, the moans of the creatures echoed in their ears as they lay awake, trying to sleep in short, restless bursts. It wasn't just the zombies that worried them anymore. It was the suffocating weight of survival, the constant fear of running out of food, of supplies, of hope. They had run out of fresh water days ago, resorting to rationing what little they had left. Even the canned goods were starting to run low. Mark, their once reliable leader, was gone, replaced by a hollow emptiness in the group. Sarah, though strong, was becoming weary of the constant fight. Jake, the youngest of the survivors, had begun to show signs of the same fear that had gripped everyone else. Emily, once a bright and hopeful teen, was quiet now, her eyes distant, lost in the abyss that was their world. They knew they couldn't hide forever. No one could. The city of Dallas had become a labyrinth of death, a place that no one was meant to survive in. The walls of the grocery store felt like a tomb now, a cage, and it was closing in on them. They had to leave. But where could they go? Every escape route was blocked by the very thing they were running from. The highway out of the city was their best shot at survival. But that route had been overrun by a massive herd of zombies, a terrifying sight that had kept them all trapped in this hellish nightmare. The decision to run wasn't made lightly. Every survivor knew that their chances of making it out alive were slim. The herd of zombies on the highway had been growing by the day, and they weren't the slow, stumbling creatures they had first encountered. No, these zombies were fast, frantic, organized. It was as if the blood moon had enhanced them, made them more lethal, more dangerous. They couldn't afford to wait any longer. The store was no longer safe, and the undead were only getting closer. Sarah gathered the group in the back room, where they had spent most of their time hiding. The air was thick with tension, the weight of the decision pressing down on them. "We have to move," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the fear that twisted her insides. "If we stay here, we're dead. It's not a choice anymore." Jake, who had been quiet for the past few hours, spoke up, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I know," Sarah replied, her eyes meeting his. "But we don't have any other choice. We either make a run for it now, or we die here. And I don't plan on dying in this damn store." Emily, who had been sitting in the corner, hugging her knees to her chest, looked up at Sarah. "What if we don't make it? What if they catch us?" Sarah didn't have an answer for her. They all knew the risks, but they also knew that staying would be worse than trying to escape. There was no life here anymore, only death waiting in the shadows. With a final look around the room, Sarah nodded, signaling the group to prepare. They armed themselves with whatever they could find. Crowbars, knives, and even a broken broomstick. Their weapons were makeshift, nothing more than tools of survival, but it was all they had. They'd have to make them count. As they made their way to the back door, the sound of the undead grew louder, closer. The street outside was an inferno of chaos. The once quiet neighborhood was now an apocalyptic battleground, where every corner could be their last. Sarah led the group out into the alley, her heart pounding in her chest. The cool night air was thick with the stench of decay, and the blood-red moon loomed overhead, casting a sickly light over the scene. They sprinted through the back alleys, trying to stay as quiet as possible. Every step was a fight for their lives, and every corner was a potential ambush. The undead were everywhere now, shambling, running, tearing at anything that moved. The city, once a vibrant hub of life, had been transformed into a monstrous, grotesque shadow of itself. They were running blind, hoping they could make it to the highway, praying that the undead wouldn't catch them before they got there. But it wasn't easy. They could hear the growls of the zombies behind them, their ragged breathing growing louder with each step. The sound of their feet hitting the pavement was drowned out by the relentless moans that echoed through the streets. The group didn't dare look back, but they could feel the presence of the undead closing in. Then, just as they rounded a corner, a deafening roar echoed through the streets, shaking the ground beneath them. The horde had found them. "Go! Go! Go!" Sarah screamed, her voice cutting through the panic. She pushed Jake and Emily ahead, her heart racing as the undead came into view. The streets were a nightmare now. Zombies were running toward them from all directions, and they had no choice but to fight their way through. The final stand had begun. The group fought with everything they had, swinging crowbars and knives at the advancing horde, trying to create an opening to escape. Every swing was a desperate attempt to survive. Every step forward was a battle. Blood splattered across the ground, mixing with the already soaked pavement. The sound of cracking bones and torn flesh filled the air as the survivors fought for their lives. But it wasn't enough. One by one, they were being pushed back, overwhelmed by the sheer number of the undead. Emily screamed as a zombie grabbed her by the arm, but Jake yanked her free just in time. They kept moving, but the horde was relentless, and the odds of making it to the highway were growing slimmer by the second. Just as they neared the edge of the city, Sarah and Jake found themselves at the outskirts of the highway. They had made it, but their victory was bittersweet. Their clothes were covered in blood, their bodies bruised and battered. They had lost too much along the way. The sound of the battle was fading, but it was still there, lingering in the distance, a constant reminder of what they had just escaped. They looked back one last time at the burning city of Dallas, its skyline now consumed by flames. The city that had once been full of life was now nothing more than a charred, hollow shell of its former self. The nightmare was far from over, but they had survived. For now. Sarah and Jake stood on the edge of the highway, staring at the desolate road ahead. They didn't know where it would lead, or if they would make it, but they knew one thing for sure. They had survived the worst of it, and for the first time in what felt like forever, they allowed themselves a brief moment of peace. The horrors of Dallas would haunt them forever, but they were alive, and that was all that mattered. This was the end of the Dallas Zombie Massacre, a tale of survival, loss, and terror that would echo in the minds of those who lived to tell it. The city might have fallen, but the horrors that began in Dallas would live on, carried by the